I have read too many books this year that start out amazing. They have these really cool premises. They bring up these really interesting ideas. And then the book falls flat because it doesn't delve into those enough. And that is how I'm feeling about The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. Unfortunately, this is again one of these books that started out great. I was like, oh my gosh, this could be a new favorite, but then goes downhill for me. Parable of the Sower is about a girl living in the apocalypse in 2024 through 2026. So part of the reason I read this book this year is because it starts out in 2024, which is the year that I'm reading it in. We are following a teenager who is living in this walled community to protect the community from the horrors outside the community. I promise you, I said horrors with 2 syllables. I filmed this when I was sick and my voice was all groggy, and that was like a week ago, and I'm now less sick and hopefully my voice is less groggy. Well, it doesn't sound like it right now. I feel dizzy. It's okay. Our teenage protagonist's name is Lauren, and she also has what they call sharing or hyper empathy, where she feels the pain that others feel. This is definitely one of the most interesting aspects of the story, and the thing that I think was explored the most in the story. I would have loved for this to be explored in the story much more than it was, but I felt like there was decent exploration of hyper empathy in the story. We have a character who can feel feels physical pain whenever she hurts others, whenever others are hurt. And this is something that affects her all the time. And she's actually raised her parents to know this about her. And they basically try to have her control this emotion and to do everything she can to stamp it down, because it would be so easy to hurt her. It would be so easy for people to take advantage of her because she has this hyper empathy. But at the same time, she sees people hurting each other around her, and she wishes that she could give them hyper empathy, because she feels like if people could feel what she feels, then they wouldn't want to hurt other people. And this gets explored much more in depth throughout the story. This is something that she's constantly struggling with throughout the story. And at first it seems like, yeah, if everyone just felt each other's pain, then we wouldn't hurt each other. But as the story goes on, we actually have Lauren doing some horrific things herself in order to escape pain. And in order to escape the feelings of others, she does horrible things to other people. And it's such an interesting aspect of this story to have someone with this ability, I guess you could say, or this sensitivity in an apocalyptic setting that is very violent. And, she has to live in this violent, cruel world while being hypersensitive to the pain around her. I also loved the complexity of the setup of this story, even just looking at Lauren's family. Lauren's dad is very messed up as a person. He does absolutely horrible, abusive things, but he also tries to protect Lauren and look out for her, and he will offer her good advice. There is a point in the story where Lauren is feeling like the community is not going to be safe in this walled community forever, and something is going to happen, and she wants to instill the preparation in everyone else. She wants to prepare for it. She has this to-go bag. If something happens, she has all of her necessities in this bag that she can just grab and run if need be. And she wants other people in the community to also prepare. And she talks about this with one of her friends, and she scares her friend and ends up causing drama and getting in trouble for it. And her dad sits her down and is like, hey, if you want to be a leader, you can look at how to inspire people to do things to prepare without scaring them and preventing them from being able to actually do any of these things. It's really interesting because he's kind of like looking at like what motivates people, and fear can be a motivator, but the way Lauren was going about it was not a productive way to get people to prepare. Her dad's also like very insistent all the kids have firearm training in case anything happens, that like they know how to defend themselves. And it's just really interesting seeing this like complex character, because he has some good leadership qualities, but he's also treating other people in the family absolutely horribly. And it's really nice to see like the complexity of characters and what this type of environment would do to these characters. And you can even see this in Lauren wanting to be prepared, afraid that her world's going to fall apart and that she has to be prepared for this outside threat that's going to come and destroy her family, when her family is crumbling from the inside. It's not an outside threat that is coming to destroy Lauren's family. As she's starting to have these fears and wanting to prepare more and more, the more she prepares, it's like a mirrored opposite of what is going on in her family. Her family is starting to show cracks and starting to break apart. And yes, her world, her life as she knows it, is falling apart. But it's falling apart from the inside. It's not an outside threat that's coming in to get her. And in some ways throughout this experience, it's also very obvious that she is diverging from her family in some core aspects and values, and she will have to leave her family in order to actually grow as a person and continue exploring herself. And that's pretty obvious early in the story that her situation is not permanent. And, they live in this wall community, and she's afraid of the threats from outside the wall of the community. But she will have to leave the wall at some point in order to become the person that she needs to become. Because Lauren has disagreements with her father, and a lot of their disagreements, I guess you could say, surround both the empathy and religion. So her father is a leader in the community, and he's also a Baptist preacher. And Lauren has some critiques of Christianity, of her dad's preaching. And Lauren kind of develops her own religion, which is called Earthseed, which I will get into much more in depth later in this review. But whenever all of this is happening and, Lauren's like really exploring and like figuring out things for herself and realizing where she diverges from her family, I was like, oh, this is kind of a deconstruction novel. And, her family is talking about the dangers of the world outside the wall. And I was honestly expecting when Lauren eventually goes outside the wall that things are going to be a lot different than she was told. When Lauren is living inside the community, she is basically told that she has to protect herself from the people living outside the walled community. They are living on the streets. They're very violent, and, she needs to protect herself against them. And whenever she left the walled community, that is exactly what she finds. And I'm disappointed by that, because I feel like it's playing into the stereotypes that homeless people are violent drug addicts. And I'm just disappointed that whenever she left the walled community, everything she was told about the people outside turned out to be exactly correct. And I guess like in some ways I expected a little bit more, like deconstruction or exploration than we actually got. And I could say that for like so many aspects of the story, including the hyper empathy. But I think we're going to talk about the world outside a little bit. So I read, before reading Parable of the Sower, I read Octavia E. Butler's essay, A Few Rules for Predicting the Future. And I absolutely love that essay. I think it is excellent. In that essay, she talks about her inspiration for Parable of the Sower. And she says that she looked around the world and what were the problems in society that were not being addressed, and then just go 30, 50 years from her start point. And what happens if we never address those problems? What will the world look like? And then that's Parable of the Sower. And I don't buy it. I totally believe like maybe she thought that's what she was trying to do with Parable of the Sower. I don't believe in 30, 60 years in a single generation we have total societal collapse the way it is expressed in this story. I also don't feel like there was really any diving into the root causes of a lot of these issues. So the big things that we have in this book is rampant poverty, violence, and drug use. We do have like corporations taking advantage of people in desperate situations and then using them and abusing them and not helping the people in poverty. Violence was explored maybe a little bit, particularly with the hyper empathy aspect. I would have loved a much deeper exploration into violence and the violence that was like perpetuated against other people. You could say the exploration of violence in this book is basically people are poor, living on the streets. They don't have other means to survive. They need to be violent and steal from others in order to survive. Like it's a survival thing. But we're again being suspicious of homeless people without really exploring root causes of homelessness. On top of that, there is a lot of sexual violence against women and only against women. And there's no exploration of that other than that's what violent homeless people do. And I'm just kind of frustrated with the lack of nuance or exploration into desperateness, into homelessness, into any of these situations. Just because you are homeless does not mean you are going to be a violent drug addict who commits sexual violence. But as far as like drug use, that was like not really explored at all. And it's just like, you know, everyone outside the wall is just engaging in being terrible humans. And there wasn't a lot of exploration into like, how do we end up here? And I feel like the book possibly tried to like provide some answers, and I just disagree with the answers. But I also just don't understand how like in a single generation we got from, say, society as we know it to society in Parable of the Sower. And, you know, literacy is something that's like extremely rare in Parable of the Sower, but like people still like are still alive that happened like before societal collapse. At very least, those people, like the older generations, should be able to read. I feel like the timeline was maybe too short. I know this is a small gripe, but I want to go back to the empathy thing and how much they explored or did not explore the empathy and sharing with others. So there's a part early in the story where Lauren's dad tries to get her to kill an animal to see if Lauren also experiences this sharing with animals. And she does. Lauren can also feel the pain of animals. And then that went nowhere in the story. Now, maybe that will be addressed in the sequel. This is a book 1, so maybe all of my complaints will be explored in later books. But whenever that happened, I was like, oh, this is really important, and this is going to impact something later on in the story. And it didn't. We like never really brought up the fact that Lauren feels empathy for animals too. And we had ample opportunity whenever she's outside the wall and she's traveling. We have a character who's living in a very violent world, who is traveling through it, who does not have much options as far as food goes. And we have a scene where they are sitting around a fire and they're talking about how they had a good meal that night because they had meat that night. And I was like, how does Lauren's empathy with animals affect her view of eating animals? How does it affect her diet? particularly in a world where she does not have a ton of options as far as food goes. And I could see it affecting her diet much more when she was still in the walled community. Like maybe she would try to eat more plant-based at that point, but then when she's outside the wall, she doesn't have as many options. But like, she doesn't even grapple with it. This is not it's just like a scene that happened early in the book, and it's like, oh, she has empathy with animals. And that's it. Speaking of empathy, I actually thought the story is like not very emotional for how much we have a main character who can feel others' physical pain, not emotional pain. I've noticed this with Octavia E. Butler's writing previously whenever I read Kindred. The story itself is not written in a very emotional fashion. The story is able to yank emotion from a reader without you really getting in the character's head and like feeling what they're feeling and understanding what they're feeling. Both in Kindred and in Parable of the Sower, I never really felt like I could fully get in the head and understand what it was like to be these main characters. But there's so much going on in the story around them that does pull emotion from the reader. So maybe it's like not necessary, but it's just interesting that a story that's like focused on empathy is also like holding me at distance from the main character. Now, the Parable of the Sower is written like journal entries, and just because someone can experience empathy like that does not mean they're good at writing it and like placing you in their shoes. So a lot of that could just be chalked up to the fact that, yeah, she's writing her own story and she's not going to include all of those details, or she's not as good at eloquently expressing those things as she is at feeling those things. And in some ways, like, hyper empathy was not something that was focused on all the time in the story, even though it is something that would affect a character like all the time. And I think a lot of that could also be because she's writing her own story and this is normal to her. So while it's not normal to me, if it is something that is like normal, how likely are you to write about that in your journals? But now let's talk about a major focus of the story, which is religion, and particularly the religion of Earthseed that our protagonist creates in the story. And she says that she creates this by observing the world around her and this is the way the world works, and therefore that is her religion. And in her religion of Earthseed, like, the big thing of Earthseed is God is change. And change happens all around us all the time. It is inevitable, and we should accept change rather than resisting change. And I find Earthseed at first to be very interesting because for the most part, it's a descriptive religion rather than a prescriptive one. And she's more or less explaining things of the world around her and then, aligning herself to how the world works. I don't think that's how Earthseed continues. I think it gets quite prescriptive, particularly the longer it goes. So in the book, at like the end of each chapter and at the beginning of each chapter, there are writings from what she was writing about Earthseed. I don't know if I could just like read one of these. Okay, so like here she has, this is from Earthseed, the Book of the Living. God is neither good nor evil, neither loving nor hating. God is power, God is change. We must find the rest of what we need within ourselves, in one another, in our destiny. So these are the types of writings that she has throughout the book. It is interesting that her religion is God is change, and then she's talking about like all of the change in the world and her world changing and her perspective on the world changing, particularly her perspective on violence changing as she goes from someone who can't imagine hurting another human to doing terrible things in order to preserve her own suffering. Not preserve her own suffering, but to prevent her own suffering. The world is changing rapidly around her, and it makes sense that change would be such a core thing that she latches onto. But I found the writings about Earthseed to not make sense after a while. They felt like some of these, like, oh, that's a nice saying, but it doesn't have much like applicable value, or it doesn't like make sense if you think about it for too long, and particularly if you think about it in the context of everything else she's written about Earthseed. So like some of the things that she starts getting prescriptive about is like, God is change, so be careful what shape you make God, and just be mindful of the fact that you can affect change, and be mindful of what shape that change takes. And like, that's fine. I think all of that is good in general. But then she goes on to say things like, do not create any images of God. You can observe God in the world around you, in all the changes of the world around you, and let that be enough. Don't create God for yourself. And it's like, so you're saying don't do anything that creates change? It feels contradictory. It's like, and I'm not exactly even sure what it means of like, create no images of God. Are we talking about like, okay, so create no images of change because God is change? Are we talking about don't create change? Are we talking about literal images of change? But like, okay, so one of the things that you could see of change in the world around you is like, it's fall, the leaves on the trees are turning colors and falling off the tree. That is change. Can we not like paint an image of that? Or are we only talking about like actually creating the change in our life? Like maybe cutting down a tree. But like, we do have to cut down trees to build houses or to build communities. We do have to affect some change. So like, it makes sense that, be mindful of the change that you are affecting. It just doesn't make sense, okay? And then there is a point in the book, so she ends up basically developing a following, and not everyone in her following actually believes in Earthseed, but they agree to work together so that way they can, build a community for themselves. There's at one point someone in the story questions her about Earthseed and is like, why should people follow Earthseed? And she's like, it's basically people coming together around the same values. And in this same conversation, she talks about how the world would be better if people followed religion. Any religion. It does not have to be Earthseed. But when you look around at all the bad things happening in the world, if those people followed religion, the world would be a better place. And it's such a naive take on the situation that she's in. And, you can chalk it up to she's literally like between 16 and 18 throughout this book. She's a teenager. Of course, she's going to come up with like naive perspectives on the world. But you don't need religion to have shared values, and you don't need religion to have like a community around shared values. And no, the world would not be better if people just followed any religion, because the majority of people do follow religions and the world's not great. Like, and I also feel like as far as like the society that she is living in, like in total societal collapse, maybe in her view, religion is the answer, but it did kind of feel like all of these problems in the world, religion's the answer. And it can be any religion. Even though like early in the book she was critiquing Christianity, I disagree. I feel like this answer is particularly unsatisfying because we did not explore root causes of the problems in the world. And I do feel like if you start exploring root causes, you're probably not just going to slap if everyone follows Earthseed, the world would be great on it. And not even just Earthseed, but like any world religion. But I feel like it's a particularly unsatisfying answer after failing to explore why people are in poverty, why people are committing violent acts towards each other, why people are using drugs. Like, I wanted so much more from this story. I don't know where the story goes in the next book, and I have mixed feelings about whether I'm going to read the next book, but it will be interesting to see like where she takes all of these ideas. Also among this group of people that is following her, and we literally have like a group of like mostly adults following a teenager and then just like going along with her religion and some of them converting to her religion. We also have like older people in this group that, I mean, not all of the adults decide to convert to Earthseed, but one of the people in this group is the 60-year-old man that she falls in love with, and they fall in love with each other. And then they have a sex scene, and then they are discussing the fact that she is so much younger than him. And her answer to it is, we're both in love, so it doesn't matter. And that's as much as she thinks about the age gap. And it's not only an age gap, there's also some power dynamic differences as well as an age gap, because he owns land that he's like, hey, you can start your community on this land that I own. So he's the one who's like providing her space to start her community. That's a power dynamic difference on top of the fact that he is 40 years older than her. And whenever they have this conversation, he's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you were so young. And he like kind of freaks out about the fact that she's 18. And she's like, don't worry about it. We love each other, so it doesn't matter. And then that's like all the further discussion they've had on it. But I'm not believing, so even if she does look old for an 18-year-old, he's 60. How old did he think she was? Like, even if she was 40, she's still 20 years younger than him, and there's no way this 18-year-old is looking 40. So, like, this relationship is kind of gross, and then it's just, like, not discussed. It's like, we love each other, so let's not think about it. I'm not really okay with that. Though, to be fair, he does not believe in Earthseed, and that does create a fun dynamic. So one of my favorite scenes in the book is on the very last page, and she's been able to start her Earthseed community, and she's like so happy about everything, and she's like, God is change. And her love interest responds, that doesn't mean anything. And she says, it means everything. Everything. And I just feel like that was my experience with like the latter part of this book. I am the love interest going, that doesn't mean anything. It's a teenager rambling nonsense and then getting a group of people to follow her. I mean, I guess people are looking for answers because the world's in a bad place, but like, I wanted more from it, you know? I wanted more exploration as to like why the world is the way that it is, more deeper answers other than just follow Earthseed or be religious. I also want to say that I don't need the story to provide any answers or any solutions. I read The Bluest Eye right before this, and The Bluest Eye was amazing and absolutely did not give you answers or tell you that there's some easy solution. In fact, it forced you to realize there is no easy solution, but it still was such a powerful story and such a powerful exploration of the themes that that story was trying to tackle. And maybe the fact that I read Parable of the Sower right after reading a story that powerful, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this story maybe didn't work for me at this time. So that is my review for Parable of the Sower. If you've read this book, let me know your thoughts on it in the comments, and I hope to see you in another video. Happy reading!